Politics without the soap opera, with unfiltered constitutional conservative truth. The Conservative Review with Daniel Horowitz.
And welcome back, fellow patriots, forgotten American taxpayers, and all-around common-sense Americans, to the Conservative Review podcast. Welcome to the Independent Revolution, where indeed we are making a lot of progress here on this Wednesday, August 21st. Lots of news going on that runs the gamut of everything on immigration. So many updates on everything we spoke about yesterday. Good news and bad news. Obviously, the good news you guys all heard is that finally, after us yelping about this for 15 months, the administration has moved to vitiate, to cancel out the Flores settlement. I have a long article out today, which you could see up on the screen here, basically explaining why it's indefensible to oppose this change, why Flores is nothing but a settlement that legally can be changed as part of the original agreement, by the way, and how Trump could make this even better and hold the line against the courts. Because remember, nothing matters if we don't push back against the notion of judicial supremacy in general, but the notion in particular that illegal immigrants have rights to sue us, have rights to break into this country and enter. I mean, there's tons of stories about illegals suing us for not giving enough medical care. Like, they don't like the temperature of the burritos and they sue us. This is unbelievable. So there's a lot of bad stuff, but I know I'm kind of the doctor of doom here, so I do want to mark this occasion. They did have a good presentation of what they're doing. If this is actually implemented, now there is a 60-day waiting period. If it is actually implemented and they hold the line in the courts, this will single-handedly stop this entire wave of Central Americans from coming. Because again, if they can't get catch and release, they're not going to come. The big thing to realize is that a lot in the media are going to say, hey, you're going to indefinitely detain these people. It's a joke. No one's going to indefinitely detain them because guess what? They're not going to come once they know that we're not going to, release them after a few days. So this is good news. In addition, finally, they're stopping this odious practice of just needlessly granting bogus asylees work permits pending the adjudication. It's something that should never have been done. Obama started it. It was a lawless policy. To the extent that he implemented it, it's discretionary to a certain extent, certainly not mandatory, and they're finally ending that. Again, Mark Morgan at CBP, Matt Albence at ICE, Ken Cuccinelli is really the heavy hitter at USCIS. Great guys. And I think, the personnel, the policies we've pushed for are making a difference. So I want you guys to know when you go to Conservative Review's YouTube page and you like our YouTube channel, when you listen to this, when you subscribe, when you read our articles, when you pass them around on social media, you are making a difference. There was one of these leftist open borders activists I saw on Twitter a couple of weeks ago. Someone sent this to me. The guy was telling his following, you don't understand this Daniel guy. He's like a mid-level type of dude, but his stuff really ultimately makes its rounds on all the people making the decisions. So, he's really dangerous. Well, yes, finally, you look at the third-party asylum agreement. You look at the rule that they must declare asylum in their first safe country. You look at the expedited removal rule, and now the work permits in Flores. The administration has essentially implemented roughly half of the recommendations I've had in my Deter, Defend, Demagnetize proposal. So look, I'll take it, and now we're going to work on the other proposals, and we're going to work in the courts. I'm going to have a very special guest on today that is very well known to you to discuss the other half of this border crisis, of this sovereignty crisis. But before, I just want to mention a couple other things. Yesterday, we spoke about identity theft, and we spoke about this illegal alien that was detained among the 680 at this major workplace enforcement action in Mississippi by ICE, and how the media lied through the immigration lawyer saying that ICE ripped her away from her nursing baby, and it turned out that yesterday or 2 days ago, they actually gave her a medical exam and proved definitively that she wasn't even lactating. It was all a lie. Well, thankfully, they are not backing down, And not only aren't they backing down, this really put a smile to my face. They are now handing her over to DOJ and indicting her on identity theft. And that is something that always needs to be done. And as we mentioned, I'm sick of hearing the sob stories when they came in here and they stole from the American people. There is nothing more odious than having your identity stolen. It's terrible. And of course, Republicans are not talking about this. All of the recommendations we mentioned yesterday for what needs to be done with that. In addition, between a 74-year-old woman being burned to death by an illegal alien in Florida, another alien suffocating a 74-year-old woman in New Jersey, another brutal, brutal rape, the fourth this month, by an illegal alien in Montgomery County, Maryland. Case after case after case. Some of them I saw on my own. Some of them you guys have sent me. Between Nate and I at Conservative Review, we're going to try to cover these cases. Again, not a single elected Republican is talking about a single one of these cases and how they are totally avoidable crimes if we enforced our laws on the books, and how we need to give Americans the right to sue. We need an American Flores settlement with the government, where government settles with the American taxpayer so we don't have to pay for the hospitalization and the medical bills of those who quite literally rape Americans, steal identity, murder people. There have been more illegal alien murders and rapes and child molestings just since the El Paso shooting that I have chronicled, and I only see a fraction of the universe of this. Again, we're going to shame these people into covering it. Now, connected to this, when you bring in mass numbers from Mexico, from Central America, very violent cultures, you're going to bring in the culture. And a big part of the culture is just like you have in the Islamic world, the jihadist culture. You have a cartel, a narco culture, which is not just about drugs, but is an entire ideology and strategy of terrorism and violence. Now, what I'm finding is, while the administration finally is listening to many of our suggestions on immigration law, immigration policy, and it is having its effect in stemming the tide of Central Americans, what they clearly have not made any progress with is actually A, identifying the problem of the cartels, and B, implementing the policies on the ground through the military, through the Coast Guard, through CBP, to properly counter what is quite literally an invasion of our country through the cartels. Today we bring back to you really an old guest, but the first time he's going to be on our video podcast, Colonel Dan Steiner. As you all know, 31 years in the Air Force. He served at CENTCOM, Kosovo, Gulf War in Iraq. He was Operation Iraqi Freedom. He also did some time in Central America, has a tremendous knowledge of Mexico and Mexico's politics and the cartels. Most importantly, last decade, he commanded Texas's military forces on behalf of former Governor Rick Perry, coordinating the Texas forces with NORTHCOM, as well as with some Mexican counterparts, at least the ones that possibly could be trusted, to deal with this really cross-border insurgency that we're dealing with. So to get all of the news on the cartels, what's going on, what we should be doing, we welcome to our video show for the first time, Colonel Dan Steiner. Hey, Colonel, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Dan. How you doing?
Hey, well, you're our second guinea pig as our second guest on our video, and look, I have a face for radio, so it's great to take some of the heat off my face and have a second person with me today.
Yeah. Well, I will tell you, there's a reason I'm not in Hollywood. So, but no, you're right. I mean, some of the things you said this morning about some of the trends, it almost appears that maybe out of happenstance, or probably because of what you said, the pressure that you're putting on people and people like you're putting on DC, we're starting to see a trend of, at least internally here, of some smarter decisions being made. I wish that good news was asymmetric. I wish I could come on here today, Dan, and tell you that corresponding to that is a lot of good news coming from outside of our country with this issue of stability near the United States. Well, and you and I have talked about this for the last couple of days. I don't have good news for you. And I saw a couple things this morning that really bothered me, and I told you about them. You and I started texting back and forth with a few other folks. And I'm here to tell you that Mexico, I don't know that you can honestly say that Mexico is in control of Mexico. And I know that's an ugly thing to make a statement on. But last week, I saw the story about how Mexico had become our #1 trading partner. They had bumped off Canada, and they were up to, I think, 15% or something like that. And I read that, and I was going over some other articles, and I thought, well, this is interesting. To a guy who truly believes that Mexico City truly doesn't run Mexico. They show up to all the functions, they have the high balls, they do the parades, but at the end of the day, I'm not really sure Mexico City runs Mexico. So when I read the thing about the #1 trade partner now, the United States being Mexico, two things popped in my head, and I think I talked to you about them. Was number one, the odds of making Mexico be responsible for what's going on in Mexico probably just went down 1,000%. I mean, how do you applaud someone for being your #1 trading partner, then turn around and tell them that they don't know what they're doing? So, DC's not going to do that. Secondly, it is amazing to me to believe that I can sit here in front of you today and tell you straight-faced, and I've already told you this, is the cartels run Mexico. So did we just admit last week, as dramatic as it sounds, I know, but I think that's what you and I can prove today when we talk. Mexico, our #1 trading partner, is run by the cartels.
Our #1, again, let's take that slow. Our #1 trading partner, not just our neighbor to the south, shares a long, almost 2,000-mile border, but our #1 trading partner is run by the people that, if you look on the internet every day, are beheading people and committing all sorts of violence, which we're going to soon explain. It comes to our side of the border as well.
And I know there are people inside the Beltway, they're probably going to give you a ton of grief for having me come on here and say that, but I'll defend it. I defended it on my blog last week. I've defended it with friends. Most of my friends that worked in the area that I worked in agree with me. But it's a simple fact that the Mexican government, and we'll go over several points here to make my point. The Mexican government is our #1 trading partner, and they don't run the country. And I'm not sure how we as a nation address that. And I think the typical way we'll do it right now is we won't address it. Just like you notice, they're not addressing the immigration issues, the invasion of our border, our sovereignty issues to our south. I don't think there's any way they address this. And I don't think they have a plan to even consider how to address it. So they'll ignore it.
Colonel, I just want to kind of tee you up here. Just so you could run with this. What you just said, they're not addressing. So again, my problem is this. I feel that the president really, with the May border numbers, he was pushed to the wall. He looked like a fool. I mean, the numbers were 3 times worse than under Obama. Every promise that he made went out the door. He knew he had to act. So finally, like I mentioned, about 5 or 6 of my immigration policies that many of us have been pushing for over a year, he has now implemented, or is in the process of implementing, and the numbers are coming down. But what he doesn't feel, what he's clearly not being briefed on, it's too much of a gray zone conflict, is, a week and a half ago, likely CDN cartel, shot over 50 rounds of automatic fire into our boats. They're still constantly getting runners over, not the families surrendering, although they are coming, but in fewer numbers. The runners, the really bad guys, the gangs, the cartel mentality, and we see this with a lot of the crimes committed by illegal aliens. It really has this hallmark of burning bodies, which we didn't see in large degree in this country until recently. But it's too subtle. You don't see a World War II style traditional invasion, black zone conflict, a battalion of Mexican soldiers coming over the border, marching over. So he doesn't realize it. So there's no desire not only not to act, but to even properly diagnose and identify the problem that, wait a minute. You, Mr. President, are talking about Greenland as a strategic asset, but what about the strategic asset of our own border, 70 miles into it, the cartels controlling it with their hacones, the islands in the middle of the Rio Grande, a little bit on the Mexican side, right here, where, yes, we're starting to realize we could assert sovereignty on cutting off some of the magnets, the catch and release in immigration law and policy, but we don't seem to be catching on to our sovereignty in the more physical border sense. Like, we have a border, and we have the right to defend it, and it's being invaded, and we will treat it like we would any other invasion. That's what I want to tee you up with. Why are they not looking at it like that? Why should they? And what do you think, the next steps are? So just take it away, Colonel.
Yeah. So let's talk indicators. So this is kind of after I came out of command and I went into a different area. Indicators are the things that the intelligence community always tried to deal with. So there are some indicators in Mexico. They're just absolutely troubling. AMLO from day one. By the way, we're talking about a guy, Dan, who won the elections in Mexico back in 2006. Now, I know that's kind of hard for people to believe, but he did. He ran against Calderon and he beat him. The problem was the PAN party was not going to put up with that. So they cooked the recount, and I mean, they actually cooked it. I mean, we verified that they cooked it. But when the dust settled, AMLO put his people in the streets of Mexico City and protested for about 3 months, some of it violently. So this is a guy who has had a left of left mentality since day one. He's the president now. He ran on a campaign this time and won, saying, these drug lords are not the major problem. It's social structuring that's our problem. So Mexico, about, pick it, 2.5 decades ago, Mexico had this problem in southern Mexico called the Zapatistas, a leftist guerrilla communist movement. And they couldn't figure it out. They couldn't beat them. It's kind of like the cartels. They couldn't beat them. They couldn't appease them. And it was getting worse. So what did Mexico do? Even way back then, they gave them a piece of land. They went in and they said, here's your chunk of property. This is yours. Keep it. Do whatever you want with it. We'll leave you alone. I mean, they seceded a part of Mexico to the Zapatistas. Period. That's what they did. To me, there's every indication that AMLO's theory towards the violence in Mexico, which is driven by the cartels, is to secede land to the cartels. So yesterday, or it might have been 2 days ago, someone from the Ministry of the Interior in Mexico goes and has a meeting with who they believe are cartel members. Now, they're either ignorant and not realizing they weren't cartel members, or they just lied to the media, and somebody needs to pick. What happened was the press found out who was actually there. The people that the Minister of the Interior, I got her name written, Mrs. Sanchez, the people she met with were Autodefensas, and you and I have talked about them before, and that's a whole different conversation down the road. But they're basically Mexican militias that are just sick of all the insecurity at the middle class, poor person level.
Yeah, so Autodefensas is sort of like, what the media really focused on in the 90s in America, these patriot militias in America. This is the Mexican version called Autodefensas.
Correct. So she sits down for a meeting with them thinking they're cartels and says, basically, if you'll put down your guns, we'll leave you alone. So to cut to the chase, Dan, I truly believe that AMLO is attempting to use the Zapatista model against the cartels. He knows he can't get the violence down. He doesn't have a functional law enforcement system. He has no judicial system. You should have just took that Meridian money and just flew over Mexico and threw it out the window. I mean, this idea that we were going to go in there and restructure their court systems,
and again, Colonel, folks, for those of you who don't know, the Meridian Initiative, Congress spent somewhere $7-8 billion over the last decade and a half, building up their infrastructure, security, and just like in the Middle East, probably a lot of it went to the cartels.
Yeah, it's money out the window at 30,000 feet. I mean, that's what it turned out to be. Their court system is no better than it ever was. That's why we always insist when these kingpins are caught, they're brought here, because it's the only chance we have of really getting them in a maximum security prison. But I truly believe what AMLO's trying to do is take the model that did work against the Zapatistas and go towards the cartels with it. So think about that for a minute, Dan. If what this man wants to do, and he's got 5 more years to do it, and he's got whoever the next president of the United States is to either fight over it or go along with him on it. That's why how critical is 2020 to us. You take the cartels, you tell them, this is your piece of property. Just stop killing each other, and we won't bother you. We won't come in your land. We won't do anything for you. Then today he turns around and gets his court system to start legalizing at the personal level, step 1, the possession of cocaine. And in the article that I sent you about this whole court ruling on the possession of legally having cocaine, it makes a comment in there, reading in between the lines, that the goal here is to really get the war off of the cartels. In other words, the violence in Mexico is spurred by the drug industry. So does AMLO believe, does the Mexican government believe that if they legalize cocaine slowly, or whatever speed they want to travel, that again, they're trying to diffuse their violence, which they can't handle? Their police department's corrupt. He promised to get the military off the streets. He doesn't have a way to stop what's going on, and the murder rate's going up. And so I think the Zapatistas, who are his people, by the way, he has always been supportive of the Zapatistas since he was a young man. That's the model he's chasing. Do we in the United States understand that? And if we understand at the intelligence community level, when are we going to tell the public that?
So let me just distill it for our listeners, our viewers here. You're saying that you're putting together a couple things that recently happened, and the Zapatistas they're not cartels, they're leftist guerrilla folks that operated in the Chiapas, the southernmost province in Mexico, all the way to the south near Guatemala, and it kind of gave them autonomy. And now he's using that as a model for the cartels, who they're everywhere, but most prominently for us, they're in the north Tamaulipas province, which is what borders, southern Texas, the Rio Grande Valley, where all the migration is coming in, all the gangs are coming in, the drugs, everything that's bad is coming in there. And it's kind of the opposite, the exact opposite. This is very important, and it ties into my opening monologue here, which is that border agents tell me, and I know this is right, and I know you know this is right, what worked over the last 6 weeks or so to stem the tide, the trajectory of the illegal migration, was not the Mexican enforcement. Border Patrol agent friend of mine, Sergio Tinoco, put this out even publicly on Twitter. It was not. It was the amalgamation of these magnets that we removed on our side, we started enforcing. So if anything, AMLO's moving, you're saying, to a more laissez-faire. So that means our biggest trading partner now has just narco-terrorists running the show right on our border. Now I want you to take that to the next level. What that means for America, what that means for the border agents. Talk also about the significance of the CDN cartel, the Next Generation Zetas, now taking over, moving east into the Rio Grande Valley, or the part of Mexico opposite the Rio Grande Valley, to Miguel Alemán from the Gulf cartel, and why they're possibly more of a strategic threat.
Well, so I'll put my tactical hat on. Before I became a strategic thinker, in my younger days in the military, I was a tactical guy. I was an operator. We were weapons shooters. Think about the difference between how the cartels looked 10 years ago and how they look today. When I got back from the war in 2003, and I got into a new position, and part of that position was to watch what was going on to the United States South, particularly Mexico, in a very open way and a very sensitive way. One of the things that really struck me was when I watched some of these cartel squads, as I called them back then. They had weapons. They were mismatched. Some guys had cool clothing on. Everybody's trying to look like the soldier coming out of Afghanistan. Start strapping stuff on your LBEs, your load-bearing equipment. Start trying to look like you're just some combat warrior because it looks cool. And although they were teams of gunmen, hired thugs that were running around for these cartels, compared to how some of them are starting to look today, as Jason calls some of these guys now, this particular group that you're talking about with the White Walkers, very uniformed in their uniforms, very uniformed in their weaponry, very new weaponry, very standardized positions. The amount of weaponry in a team is almost indicative of what we would call a heavy platoon, really. I mean, you've got the right mixture of automatic weapons, crew serve weapons, indirect fire, RPG. So they look different, and they act different. This shootout between CJND and I always get lost in acronyms. That was different. And so we keep looking at Mexico as saying, well, drug cartels have always had gunmen that run around with them, and that's not a big thing. It is different, Dan, and they are getting different. And so you take their capabilities, now you go back in the strategic world, you take their capabilities and you take their intent and you mix it with their degree of emboldenedness, and we have a very dangerous situation.
Plus, Colonel, take that to the next level. It's not just, they're on the other side of the border. Maybe once in a while they're getting drugs and no one in the IC or national security apparatus cares about drugs. It's that it's a cross-border insurgency that they have populations on, Starr County, Hidalgo County, Cameron County, in the RGV in Texas, that some of them are downright cartel members. I mean, Jason bumps into them all the time. Because of their stupid immigration policies for so many years, they've been allowed to come here illegally, some legally, some anchor babies that become legal. Over time, their cartel bosses living in Texas, directing the flow back and forth. Then you have vulnerable populations of Hispanics that are literally, I have a border agent friend of mine who is, he doubles over as also, he's in the military too. So he was in Afghanistan. So he was like, dude, this is an insurgency like we see overseas, and it crosses our border. Also, if you look at a poverty map, those 3 counties I just mentioned are among the poorest counties of all 3,000 counties in this country. So certainly, again, a lot of opportunities for the cartels to come in. My understanding is that the reason why CDN and the Zetas particularly are gaining traction is not just because they're very cool and warrior-like, kind of like ISIS is for Islam, but that they're paying family members pensions for those wounded warriors, or paying higher salaries. So this is a cross-border problem.
Well, yeah. I mean, think about it for a minute. How do our special operators work? There's a time when they appear very kinetic. There's a time when you see them the way Hollywood predicts them or shows Rambo. Them to be, just the Rambo appearance. But our special operators also have a very in-depth mode of covert. And so to think that everything they do stops at the river is insanity. You and I have talked before, you've talked to Jason before and Derek before about absolutely some of the best collection against our law enforcement attempts to stop them take place by them along our border. You can't go to an airport. You can't bring law enforcement materials in there. You can't maneuver up against that area of conflict, is what I call it. You can't do that with assets without them knowing it. They collect at the human level. They collect at the signal intelligence level. So our border is under contention. And it's not just under contention by guys that might drive up and drive across the river in a truck and try and throw a load of dope out. They're spending an inordinate amount of money prepping their area of operation. So to think that those guys aren't on our side of the river, yeah, they're not carrying their saws and their, AKs and whatnot, but they're operating on our side of the river. They know where the stash houses are. And if you allow the Mexican government to continue to let those guys become more emboldened, if we allow them to let them become more emboldened, you remember not just 2 months ago, you and I were talking about our guys on our side of the river, our military being disarmed because it was a mistake. It was a misunderstanding.
We know now of 3 incidents that I've seen reported, and I'm sure there were more.
Well, so all of that creates emboldenedness. You had greater capabilities. You are emboldened more. The Mexican government's doing the Mexican government's trying to figure out what piece of property to give them in order to make them leave the government alone. How does any of that paint a picture where our number one trading partner is in control of their own nation? That's the part that fascinates me. I don't know how anyone can look at us with a straight face and say, well, we're speaking to Mexico in Mexico City. We had a dinner last night, and at that function, the secretary of blah, blah, blah told us such and such. How does that resonate within 300 miles of the border? It's worthless.
So here's my problem. Our thick-headed IC community, government bureaucrats at state, DOD, DNI, all these places, they seem to only understand black zone conflict, where they're directly coming over and just shooting at us. And they actually almost are doing that. But they don't understand gray zone conflict. And the problem that I found is our adversaries understand that we don't understand that either. So therefore, as such, they're always smart enough to go up to the line and not cross that line because they don't want to elicit a reaction. So could you discuss that through the prism of what happened a week from last Friday when our Riverine crew, CBP's Riverine crew, was patrolling at around 2 in the morning. It was a Friday morning, 10, 11, whatever, 12 days ago by now. And we have the pictures we'll put up on the screen right here. You could see, folks, the bullet holes through the words custom and border protection. I mean, if that's not an irony, I don't know what it is. And they ran away. Why is it that no one in government seems to care? And you and I have talked about the fact that it's probably not in the daily presidential briefings, this type of stuff.
Correct. So, like I've told you before, one of our fallacies is that when we discover something at the intelligence level or the operators, the intelligence people, they intermingle very well. And between the operator saying something and the intelligence collector saying, okay, we'll go figure that out for you, that all becomes information. And then as that information starts to flow through the pipes, it starts hitting chambers. Now, this sounds scarily familiar, like the whole 9/11 Commission. I know that's going to click in your head. So you get information, you think this is actual information. I will tell you from a tactical standpoint, what happened on that island last week was an ambush. And was it a deliberate ambush? I don't know. But tactically, if you have an ambush near, if you're doing something and your adversary suddenly pops up right in your grill, there's only one way you get out of that. You shoot your way through it. That's probably what they did. But the fact of the matter is they had the intent to shoot at Border Patrol's boat. They had the capability to shoot at that boat. And what they recognized, which they took back to their intelligence collection capabilities, is the boat took off. And we didn't come back in 30 minutes later and pound that island till it sunk. They capture that.
So, Colonel, take this to the next level. Us laymen, civilians that never served in the military, I think your average person, and it's not just a conservative audience, just any American would think, okay, we're at a forward operating base in Afghanistan or Iraq. Hey, someone just shot at us. That means they had the intent to shoot at us, and like you said, the ability to do it. That's a problem. So everyone would expect, and this is thousands of miles away with a very dubious understanding of why it affects us, but nonetheless, we would then go outside of that forward operating base and clean up what needs to be cleaned up. This happens at our own border. And look, I know that area across from Las Grullas, what's it called? Man, I forget these names. And Miguel Alemán in it starts with an F, and I'm losing my mind here, the name of the city in Texas, but it's in Starr County. The cities, it's not just desert like in Arizona. In Texas, the streets, you look at a Google map, they go right up to that river. They're right there. Our civilian population, our homeland is right there, and we will not regard that as, dare I say, an act of war.
No, I will tell you, as a guy that was in the business of sending teams out to defend fobs, once you figure out somebody's hit you and you figure out where they are, you go hit that. Typically in our world, we did that we call air support and we say, hey, we're taking small arm fire from point X. And then we vector something over, and I don't care if he's still there or not. We pound it because the message is, if you stay still long enough and pull the trigger at us, we're going to come back and turn all this into dust. And what we did was we DD miled out. The boat team was overmatched, so the boat team tactically withdrew. Now, should we have gone back and whacked whoever was at that location? You bet. Should we have occupied that little piece of dirt afterwards? You bet. How severe of an event was that? What part of that entire story made it to the president's desk? That's my point to you about how things begin to get filtered. And you have great tactical information, and by the time it starts going through senior reviews, including political reviews, before it gets to the White House, then people start saying, that's not what we're going to talk about today. You all need to figure that out. We've got to go talk about this. And so things like that event fall off the table. That creates frustration. What your viewers need to realize is when events like that happen, you embolden your enemy. The first thing Jason and I talked about the day that happened was, just like the guys that got to come back from disarming the two soldiers got to brag about it, think about the guys who are on that island that ambushed that Border Patrol boat. Think about the machismo they gained. Yet they go back and they look better. They got better weapons. They got a government that won't chase them. When the two cartels had the big gunfight last week just outside of Roma, Texas, by the way, just about every round that was fired in that gunfight could have made it into Roma. Some of that gunfire was probably 50 cal gunfire, and most of it was 7.62, just listening to the audio tapes. That means anybody in the town of Roma, by the grace of God, didn't get hit by rounds that are just keep going. So do I have to endanger a U.S. citizen by being on your side of the river? No. I got to have a firefight like that, and then all those rounds travel 2 miles away and kill 50. What's a drive-by shooting do in most cities? Kills an innocent kid, right? You see the story every day about 3-year-old gets killed in drive-by shooting. When that happens along our border cities, what are we going to do? Are we just going to say, well, it's happening on that side of the border. There's just nothing we can do about it.
This is mentally ill. We have spent, by some estimates, $4 trillion since 9/11 in the Middle East. We have it on our border, in our border, physically shooting across our border, and then they have networks in all 50 states, pretty much, and transnational gangs contracting with them, doing all sorts of violence, and it's just not viewed as an act of war. It's not viewed as a national security threat in any way. And like, what frustrates me is our mutual friend Todd Bensman, we brought him on to discuss the extracontinental SIAs, the Middle Easterners coming over. To the extent you mention national security and terrorism, Daniel, you mean like Middle Easterners coming over? And I'm thinking, look, that might be a problem, but no, this is actually more prominent of a problem. It's more sustained of a problem, and there's more people involved in it, and I can't figure it out. I've heard this came from that island, and it's a big island. It's probably the biggest island in the Rio Grande. It's right there. I'm hearing, I have a friend who's in a riverine unit in that county, that they can't get recruits. In other words, more than a lack of boats, they have a lack of manpower to man the boats. In other words, they actually have more boats than people to man them now. I'm hearing, you know, I don't know how to say this. A lot of the members are saying, hey, someone's going to have to get killed in order for something to change. But I look at this a little bit more morbidly. I don't think the death of one agent kind of just in a quiet ambush that's not really on a camera that you could disseminate to the public at night, I think Trump will mention it. I think he would talk about it if, God forbid, it happened. I don't think you'd see a policy change. I think you would need a cartel or illegal alien 9/11 to perhaps change this. And I don't know. I don't know what more to do. But you see what I'm saying? It's still too subtle, and the president just doesn't feel... It's not like having facilities all over your border being filled to the brim with the humanitarian crisis. And let's face it, that's what prompted them to act, not the security crisis for Americans or the public charge, the diseases, all this stuff going on. It was for the illegals, and they were getting hit on the treatment. You know, never. It's never about Americans. What would you suggest if you were called right now to do what you did for Rick Perry, to do for the president of the United States? What would you do?
Well, let me back up for just a second. Let me paint a different picture for you and your viewers. Suppose that picture that you and I and Jason, some other people, and I know you have it out there. Suppose we had an article get published of all those guys standing together, uniformity in uniform, uniformity in weapons, uniformity in their stance, everything that makes them look, if you look like a duck, talk, quack like a duck, and you're a duck, right? Let's say that little picture was a picture of a Hezbollah unit just on the other side of Roma, Texas. What would be the alarm bells in D.C.? What is if Iran put out a picture and said, remember when they said to us, we're closer than you think?
Is Qasem Soleimani when Trump
got
rid of the Iran deal.
That picture was a Hezbollah team sitting just outside Matamoros. This country would go nuts. We would, the D.C. would just, but here's the problem. Because it's a Mexican cartel, it doesn't, they're not going to do anything. So, Dan, they got two modes of operation. They covertly operate in our country. They execute people every day. A huge part of our crime in our nation is based upon their drug industry. And I know they argue, well, it's your addiction. And don't give me that. You come here and you create crime in our country covertly. You overtly do crime in your country, but they're in every city of our country. The Mexican mafia, you name it, they're already here. So they have two modes of operation. The story is they're operating in our country. That's the reality. These guys that sit over there in these fancy uniforms, their covert ops are here, and they've been here, and they're operating here.
And even the overt action, it's not overt in the sense that they'll do what they did from their side of the border to our side of the border through shooting 50 cal gunfire, like in Chicago. But what you do see is, as our mutual friend Derek, former head of DEA's Special Operations Division, that over time he started to see, wait a minute, I'm seeing, those cartel dead body pictures that you have, the burnt, the chopped up, the duct taped. You do see that in our country now. It's not out in the open as much as it is in Mexico. It's not as large in numbers. You're not going to see 20 people hanging from a bridge, but you will find in some sort of a house. Not yet. And that's the thing. Why does everything have to wait until it happens?
So you got a cartel boss, and you and I talked about this last week. And going back to this whole issue of how soft is our number one trade partners, so-called government, on these cartels. So last week, a cartel boss sends a videotape to the president of Mexico. And in that videotape, he's asking him if he feels okay, wishing him well. It sounds like him and they're just buddies. And then he says, hey, by the way, your governor in my territory is in cahoots with my adversary, and I need you to do something about it so I can go back to taking care of the people in my territory. So back to this theory of these guys are starting to lay claim to geographical sections of Mexico. It's not just about the ports of entry anymore. It's not about getting dope across a river. They're laying claim to pieces of land. And this is a video to the president saying, I need you to do something about this governor so I can take out my adversary so my people, which he means everybody lives in that territory, are safe. This is how autonomous they believe they're getting. And his response to that is, it appears, in my opinion, is, if I give you these zones where you are the boss, will you stop all the violence? How insane is that?
Folks, and you know what's funny? Anytime I try to talk about this, so all these Teletubbies in government, and yes, Colonel Dan is the originator of the Teletubby term, so we will put it on the screen in honor of the Colonel here. But our Teletubby friends are like, Daniel, they're not terrorists, it's just drugs. Look, 18 U.S.C. 2331, global terrorism is defined as to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. That's the definition of international terrorism under our laws.
Yes.
Colonel, I mean, isn't that literally what they do?
You've got cartels that go into towns in Mexico now and physically tell the town, we'll come back and kill all of you if you don't change what you're doing. How is that not fitting someone in DC's definition of a terrorist organization? How? And if you don't label them as terrorists, you embolden them. If no one's dealing with them, after that shootout across the river from Roma, there was no big, it used to be CDN had come pouring in there and they'd put a battalion-sized unit in there underneath Calderon especially for a month or two. And then they'd force them out of the area, kind of like we do Afghanistan. We'll saturate an area to make it cool down. Nothing happened. The next day, Jason and I are talking, it's like no one rolled into town. No one came into town to take control of that event. So you embolden these cartels, the government emboldens them with these indirect discussions about how do I appease you? You know, the typical liberal progressive dogma, the Chamberlain of Mexico now. How do I appease you? How do I get you to stop being aggressive? What do you want? And then we sit over here and we just say, well, it's Mexico, we're not worried about it. And what does it take for that to no longer be denied? And I will tell you, you saw the blog I put out last week. Imagine you're driving from city to city in the United States, and it's 7 o'clock in the morning, and you go by an overpass and you see something, and it's a body hanging upside down, and it has no head, and there's a sheet with writing on it saying something, and you get to work, and you find out the people at work tell you, well, that's about the third time that's happened. And then you go down the road to another company, and a month later, and you see 5 or 6 burned out modified vehicles that look like war wagons. And you think, good grief, I sat in traffic for an hour. I wonder what that was all about. You go to work, you tell everybody at work about it, and they go, again? That's Mexico. That's our #1 trading partner, where people drive to work past these cartels hanging guns out the windows and modified armored vehicles, hanging people from overpasses. And they just drive by. The Mexican people are just like, oh, well, I'm just going to drive by that. And we sit back and just say, well, it's just drugs. We got bigger things to worry about in the world. Okay. But I don't want to be the I told you so guy. And I know you don't want to be the I told you so guy. You asked me how I would deal with this if Trump called me and said, how do you deal with it? Well, I will tell you, when I was a civilian cop, when I came out of active duty, I went and worked for the police department at Fort Worth PD, St. Louis PD for 10 years. I went back to active duty. In those 10 years, I learned something, that criminals respect one thing. They respect fear. That's what they respect. We used to tell people back in the day, God knows you can't do this anymore. If I got to come back here, there's going to be hell to pay. That's all there is to it. I don't know what kind of messaging we're doing in Mexico, but if we do the right messaging, if we do the right things, then we need to get the message across. And not to AMLO. He's the blue Teletubby running around in circles at the grass hut. We got to get the message to the people that really run the country, Dan. And I know that's terrible, and people are going to be mad at you for letting me put that on your show, but that's how we have to do this.
Well, doesn't that message have to take the form of a CDN guy or Gulf guy one day? There's a Marine sniper or something that just quietly drops them, because that really instills fear.
Well, you're happy. It's Friday night. It's 4:00 in the morning. You're drunk on your butt. You've had a good day. You feel like you're invincible. You're immortal. And then all of a sudden, someone snatches you. And when you wake up, you're in Georgia inside a facility, or you're in Cuba inside a facility. This is how we dealt with Osama bin Laden. That's how we deal with these guys. Hey, where did Jose go? I don't know. I haven't seen him. And then if you really want to be cruel, you start doing like SAS used to do, and you leave your card or you leave a coin on what unit did that. And that's the kind of effects-based operations that you start putting against these guys. You know, the movie Clear and Present Danger vilified a president that got sick and tired of what was going on. You know, at the end of the movie, the president was the bad guy because he was authorizing all these terrible missions down there. I got news for you. If we don't take that direction, then just wait for those people to hang from the overpasses on our side of the bridge. And then everybody goes, and then it becomes a political football, and it's Trump's fault, it's the liberals' fault, and then it's just a game of politics from there on.
No, exactly. And here's the thing, Trump has nothing to lose. By designating them as terrorists, something he could do tomorrow that focuses attention immediately. It, at the very least, before operations, it at least brings the military mindset, the national security mindset to the border, not as like it's some domestic tax policy issue. Then next, obviously, would authorize us to grab some of these guys. And then also, you know, what's so important is, to me, the biggest thing I hear that prevents us from doing this is the most unbelievably hypocritical, counterintuitive, circular logic I've ever heard. It's all about Mexican sovereignty. So the Mexicans admit they have ceded their own thing to people that are biting us. They're sicking their dogs on us. So our sovereignty could be violated, and we can't defend our sovereignty if that would mean going on their soil, which they don't control anyway. I mean, that's basically what they're telling us.
Yep. And then you've got the model that really works, the Mossad. You never say anything. The guy disappears. Everybody in Mexico starts running stories. Vice News starts running stories about there's been 7 high-level members of the drug cartels disappear in the last 2 months. And the rumor is the United States is behind it. And the answer is no comment.
See, the problem is Trump is just incapable of that. I mean, he
DC's incapable of that, Dan. I don't know who we'd put up there that's capable of that. DC's incapable. Trump could do it, and they would attack him worse than we should be attacking the cartels.
No, I don't mean just the operations. I mean keeping it quiet, just not bragging about it.
You'd have to turn off his Twitter account. There's no doubt about it.
But anyway, yeah, we're about out of time. Man, Dan, this was very engaging. I could go on for hours and hours, but my editors will get upset here. It's going long. The same way the Colonel did this on Mexico, he could do the same thing with Iran, China, what's going on in Hong Kong. We didn't even get to that. So much more. Colonel Dan Steiner is our national security advisor here at the Conservative Review. Thank you so much, Colonel, for joining us today. And thank you all for listening. Send me your comments, concerns, and questions for the Colonel at dhorowitz@blazemedia.com. Till tomorrow, God bless you all, and thanks for listening.